Hi, Alison.
Hi, Lauren. So great to
Hi.
see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. Before we start, I just want to welcome everyone online. Great to see so many people joining us today. And before we get started, for those of you that don't know me, just very quickly to introduce myself, I'm Lauren Branston. I've spent nearly the last 30 years working on social and environmental issues and stakeholder engagement. I've led corporate affairs and sustainability functions in large corporates and advise a wide range of global CEOs, boards, and nonprofits on culture, strategy, sustainability, and communications. I'm now very happy to be the CEO at the Institute of Business Ethics, which is a nonprofit working to share knowledge and best practice in ethics and to create space for discussion of ethics in business. The Institute is funded by a wide range of supporters. If you want to find out how to support our work, please do get in touch. I only started in my role 3 weeks ago. This is actually officially day 14. So already since joining, I've been inspired by the work of the Institute. We're actively engaged with supporters on topics and conversations such as how to develop an ethical culture, the value of an ethical culture, responsible AI, speaking up, corporate advocacy, DE&I, the role of ethics in sustainability. I'm very excited about my new role, but I'm probably more excited about this conversation with Alison today at this moment. So that's enough about me and the Institute. And next, I'd like to welcome everyone listening in. It's been so interesting to review the attendee list and see that we have such a broad range of participants today. Leaders are joining the discussion from a huge range of different functions: corporate affairs, ethics and compliance, people and culture, finance, sustainability, legal. We have people joining from the non-profit and the academic world. We have people from in-house and from consultancy. Welcome to everyone online. I think that the range of participants is really a reflection, Alison, of your book, Higher Ground, How Business Can Do the Right Thing in a Turbulent World. The fact it's been written in such a clear, no-nonsense and compelling way is a book that's based very clearly in the reality of doing business today. I think that's part of the reason why it's resonating so widely. And we'll get into that in a minute, a little bit on the technical side of how the session will run. We have an hour and 5 minutes or so together, an hour where we're recording the session and we will upload this video to our YouTube channel. And thanks also to my colleagues, Alex and Katie at the Institute, who'll be helping me to manage questions from the participants in the webinar. So do put your questions into the Q&A box now, if you can, to make their job easier. And we'll be asking Alison as many of your questions as possible later on in the session, after we've heard from you, Alison, on some of the key themes coming out of the book. Let me now just introduce you, Alison. So just as a very top line, you are a sustainable business thinker and leader. You are clinical associate professor at NYU Stern School of Business. And your book, Higher Ground, How Business Can Do the Right Thing in a Turbulent World, has been so well received globally. It was longlisted for the Financial Times Business Book of the Year for 2024, and the only book, as you said to me earlier this week, on ethics on the shortlist. Thank you for joining us today, and many, many congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. And I think, yes, the variety of the people on the line, but also your career speak to how expanded our view of business ethics and social responsibility is today. So it's an intriguing moment to be talking about this topic. And also welcome to your new role at the IBE. You seem to be settled in already and to have hit the ground running. So that's fantastic to see.
Thanks, Alison. And so can you explain a little bit more for the people on the call, just about your background and how you came to write this brilliant book?
Yeah, so I don't want to go too back far in history. We'll be here all day. But I spent a time in my very early career working in strategy consulting and in political risk, and then I spent 12 years in a profession that's often called corporate investigations or business intelligence. I'm British, as people can hear. I work for a British company called Control Risks. I was head of investigations first for the Middle East and Africa, and then for the Americas. And so I spent 12 years looking into fraud, money laundering, doing anti-corruption due diligence, political risk assessments, and really trying to help businesses operate in what we used to call high-risk emerging markets. In that job, you deal with the ethics and compliance lead, the general counsel, and the lawyers and bankers of companies, primarily in industries like telecoms, mining, oil and gas. And you get a certain view of what ethical business looks like. But one of the uncomfortable realizations I had in that role was that the facts of the investigation, the reports I would write, the things I would come up with, seemed to be in many respects less important than the leadership and culture of the organization, and how the reports were considered and digested, and whether people were prepared to take action. So I started to ask all these questions about leadership and about culture and what we really meant by ethics anyway, because I saw repeatedly legal compliance being treated as a defense mechanism rather than a driver of change. It was about getting the paperwork, getting your ducks in a row so you could defend yourself from the regulators if one of your deals went wrong. So I went to study organizational psychology, which was really, really life-changing. And then in 2015, I moved into what is now usually called sustainability or ESG. And I hope to find the answers there. I hope to find a broader notion of ethics, consideration of topics like climate change and inequality and human rights. And I did find that. But I also found a completely different frame, a completely different mindset, different reporting lines, different people, different notions of ethical business, and completely different jargon. And I became intrigued initially by why sustainability teams and ethics and compliance teams didn't talk to each other, and what this said about the wider treatment of these topics by corporations, both from an internal governance perspective and from the perspective of how we manage these various risks and opportunities and how we show up and frame these efforts. So that's, I suppose, the origin story of how Higher Ground came to be.
Fantastic, so interesting. And I do want to come back to that question of joining the dots and the jargon and language a bit later on. But I feel like I need to start with the question, as the CEO of the Institute, with at the very start of the book, and it really struck me, you talked about all of the research that you did and the feedback that you got about the word ethics. Could you just share that part of your discovery process for the book?
Sure. So, I mean, I think, having worked in this field for a long time, and maybe you've had this experience as well, if you tell people you work on, just normal people who are not, knee deep in this world, that you work on questions of ethics and responsibility, they tend to have one of two reactions. They go, isn't that an oxymoron? Or they say they need all the help they can get and kind of go, oh, well, yeah, that's not going well, is it? But I think even more intriguingly, I did about 200 interviews for this book, and I spoke to people who are known as prominent ethics experts. And I found it so intriguing that I would get on the line with many of these people. And one of the first or second things they would say was, here's the thing, I try at all costs to avoid using the word ethics. People expect you to start singing hymns. People think it's punitive and judgmental. And so I became intrigued by how unclear we are on the notion of what it really takes to be a good and ethical business. And then how much we like to avoid using that word and rather say, this is just about the business case. This is just about capitalism. This is just about the win-win. And how keen we are to avoid having those rather more difficult discussions about responsibility and accountability. And I think That's particularly interesting because we're in the middle of a big reckoning, I think, for ESG and sustainability. I'm seeing a lot of insiders finally recognizing there might be limits to these win-win arguments, and to start to go to, again, questions of regulation and questions of oversight and questions of what companies need to do differently. And so, you know, I mean, I suppose the conclusion is we're having globally a very, very, I think, high stakes conversation that is ultimately a normative conversation about what the role we want business to play in society is. And one of the most interesting things about that conversation is no matter what side you are on, you are very likely to frame your message as just being about good business, not political, not contentious. Yet it's clear these topics are both political and contentious.
Yes, absolutely. So interesting. And within that, and I can see the questions coming in, which is great. Keep them coming. We'll get to them. But before we get to the questions coming in online, this is a very basic question in some ways, but your book does walk up to this. It's also a very fundamental question, which is, what is the definition you use for what business ethics is? You know, how should companies think about that when they go about starting to think about an ethical approach?
Oh, I mean, I think there's one question, which is a valid question, which people ask, which is, how are you supposed to think about ethics in this divided, polarized world where people have different values? We don't even agree on basic concepts of capitalism and democracy. And so that is, you know, that is a really, really valid question. We can also think about this historically. Companies, I don't think the business ethics field, but companies have often, you know, followed the Milton Friedman principle and treated ethics as a question of legal compliance. These days, compliance departments tend to be called ethics and compliance. There has been a very wide recognition that legal compliance is only going to get you so far, not least because, you know, frankly, our laws are becoming more inconsistent and more difficult to enforce internationally. So there's a recognition that ethics is not just legal compliance, but I think then there's wide confusion about what that actually is and what that actually means, not least when we think about this kind of parallel conversation going on ESG and on sustainability. So the argument I make, which takes a little bit of a while to unpack and explain, is that we need to treat ethics not as a matter of imposing top-down rules or even principles or value statements on our workforce, but we need to think about this as a collective decision-making process where we involve a wider group of voices in shaping the commitments and values of the organization. We need to put human behavior and human cognition at the center of these efforts. And then we need to get to grips with the reality, which is that a corporation can neither wall itself off from all environmental and social challenges. A corporation isn't a self-interested, profit-maximizing black box, but nor can it follow the recommendations of lots of people in the responsible business community, which is that, you know, you listen to your stakeholders and you have to take action on a broader and broader and broader range of issues. I think there's an unachievable vision which sort of suggests that a business needs to take on every environmental and social problem out there. We see that in over-promising in sustainability reports. We see this in laundry lists of goals. We see this as treatment of everything as material. We see managing to ESG reporting frameworks of treating this as ticking the box, not as a strategic imperative. So there's a narrow Milton Friedman vision, which is anachronistic and unachievable at this point. What I think is less recognized is that there are a group of people that, you know, I like and I'm sympathetic to, when nothing a company ever does will be good enough. And there's a real gotcha mindset around these topics. And if you try and be more focused and realistic and restrained, that very often leads to a barrage of negative attention. So I think if you're running a business today, you're somewhat trapped between these two unworkable visions, trying to find a more realistic path forward and somewhat drowning in bad advice and jargon.
Yeah, fascinating. I think you've managed to unpack a huge amount of that very, very clearly. I think that piece about trying to address a broader range of issues is this unrealistic expectation that people are putting on business as being able to solve these problems. And almost, I'm quite interested at the moment is this in the similarities between trying to encourage a speak up culture within an organization to improve and have a more ethical culture within an organization, but also the parallels with really business needing to think about how in society you can have a more ethical culture, and the role of corporate advocacy, or corporate speaking up in actually addressing some of those unrealistic demands on business. I talk about the line of integrity in communications, that that businesses need to get better at asking for help, and or calling out when expectations are unrealistic, and getting better at saying we can do this, but we need help to do this. And obviously systems thinking is critical in that, but companies are so inherently risk averse, because I think they think about their reputation in the short term rather than the long term, and their business in the short term rather than the long term, of actually having the courage to speak up. And I see so many similarities between speaking up within organizations and the need for companies to speak out into society to call out what needs to change. And I'm interested in your thoughts on how do you, in the book, you're so interesting on companies and CEOs needing to be quite careful about when they speak up and the issues that they feel that they need to speak up on, and the link to getting quite focused on one or two issues. And Unilever have done that recently and trying to kind of reduce that and come under a lot of pressure, for example. But could you just talk about that topic?
Yeah, no, this is a really good way into this kind of wider discussion, because I think the evolution of speaking up is a really illustrative point here. So what companies have, and they might call them speak up lines, but they're more often called whistleblowing lines. So there is a traditional idea that comes out of ethics and compliance that you have a speak up function so that employees can flag when they see illegal or unethical behavior. And you need that, because if you don't have that, you don't have a credible compliance program. And if the regulators come after you, you can't say that you gave this opportunity to speak up. We know that these need to be confidential. We know that these are about retaliation. But let's be clear that historically, these have been framed in relatively narrow compliance terms. We haven't necessarily said to employees, come and speak up about everything. And this is particularly important because the young people in my classroom and young people in general, they're maybe not so bothered about questions of fraud and corruption. They certainly should be, but you're more likely to hear, I'm really upset that the company doesn't care enough about climate change. I'm really upset that my boss is a racist or doesn't have purpose. Or, I want to complain about, the stance the company I work for is taking on a really contentious question like abortion or Palestine. So we've seen this kind of broader remit of speaking up. I think that companies are not providing necessarily a channel to capture those sort of voices, or not a very functional channel. So a couple of things have happened. There has been the rise of I often say leaking is the new whistleblowing. So I think young people don't necessarily call the internal hotline. They believe that that's career ending, but they might get together on Slack and discuss particular topics. They might try and push their boss for action. They certainly might put out inconvenient things about the culture on social media. We've seen a recent trend in the US where people have, we've had a lot of layoffs here recently, young employees filming themselves being laid off by HR and then putting it on TikTok. We can think about the McKinsey settlement, where McKinsey's just been found to be working for the FDA and Purdue Pharma at the same time, paid a huge fine. We know about that because of a leak of a pitch deck to the New York Times. And so we see young employees trying to hold companies accountable for their environmental and social impacts in a new way. And then more problematically, something I hear in the classroom is, I don't think I'm going to get anywhere with voting or political engagement, but I can pressure a brand or I can pressure my employer to do something on the activities that we care about. And so there's more and more of a push, I think, to take on and solve more and more of these problems. It's very often now miring in organizations in conflict. The tragedy unfolding in the Middle East being a very, very good example of this. It's leading to over-promising, and I think it's often resulting in many cultures, you get a loud group of employees who've got far too much psychological safety, and then maybe a lot of other employees that don't have any at all. So I think what leaders need to do is to walk a line. You can't say, we'll take on every problem out there, just yell at us and we'll do something about this issue, because it becomes incoherent really, really quickly. But nor can you try and tamp down dissent. So we need to somehow find a way to involve the collective in how we think about ethics and values. So we create less of an us and them mindset. But it's very difficult to do that, I think, without, opening yourself up to expectations that you may not be able to fulfill. So that is another example of how I think, business leaders are a little bit stuck between these competing forces today.
So thank you. It's so interesting. And, it isn't just at the employee level that you see speak up issues in the book. You give some examples of a board member at Enron saying, effectively, no one else spoke up, so I didn't. And I think that, that is also a dilemma for boards, very much, of how do you really genuinely foster a speak up culture on boards as well, and that's something that we're looking at the Institute. So we've got some questions coming in the Q&A, so I'm going to ask one of those. Coming in from Crawford Robinson, have you ever felt you needed to resign because the values of the company did not match yours, especially with the outcomes on investigations being manipulated, ignored?
This was more an issue of my clients. I tell a story. In the book about how I ended up as a witness in an FCPA investigation, because the law firm I was working with on the diligence didn't really want to hear the wider context or the inconvenient truth about how political risk and the political economy worked in Angola, but just wanted me to write a very narrowly focused report about what I didn't find. So this certainly caused me a lot of difficulties. I certainly also saw a tendency for boards and C-suites to find a convenient scapegoat, like a convenient bad apple, so they wouldn't need to acknowledge the wider challenges. I think, yes, during my career, I've also worked in organizations where the stated values and the actual behavior that was rewarded did not align. I think that is I think there are two things, both in my personal experience and in what I hear from my students, that degrade a culture quicker than anything else. And I read thousands of papers a year about ethical dilemmas. And I think there are two things. One is that the stated values are just words on the wall and are contradicted by either the incentive structure or the general frame of what it takes to be promoted around here. And then the second thing, I think, is a kind of do as I say, not as I do mindset in senior leadership. So the rules apply to you, but not to me. I don't need this ethics training. I don't need all this stuff. Just shut up and get the results. And I don't want to hear that it's too difficult. And so that kind of impunity in passing the buck and a sense that senior people are subject to different rules and different principles from everybody else. Those two things, I think, are the things that degrade the culture quicker than anything else.
Yeah, fascinating. And the other question that I wanted to ask you, selfishly asking my question next, but I will come back to the Q&A, is really around language and joining the dots. And I think this for me is about a question around the future, in a way, of the ethics and compliance function, but more broadly, that idea that there are different cultures within different functions within an organization. You talked about jargon and the need to kind of join the dots. And I think your book has struck a chord because it has just called out some of these inconsistencies, some of the challenges around the language that we're using at the moment. What do you feel is the way forward here? How do you feel we can move forward to a common language that does really drive change? There's a brilliant Brian Eno quote at the start of a book called Citizen by John Alexander, and he talks about, and I'm sort of paraphrasing terribly, that system change happens when everyone in the system realizes that everyone else in the system has also realized that the system needs to change. So that sense of collective awareness, and I love that quote, you know. But what's your thinking on language and joining the dots? And do you feel the ethics function, or people working in ethics have a role to play there?
Yeah, I really do. And I think, you know, one of the things I discovered in my career and while writing this book is, you know, I would argue jargon is a feature, not a bug, of this whole area. There's a big campaign at the moment to rename ESG as rational sustainability or something else, as if we just rename it, the political controversy will be solved. There's a real, there's a real tendency to try and put an extra letter on ESG. We can see I'm old enough to remember when DEI was just diversity, but people put a J in there, people put a B in there, people put an A in there. We seem to be sort of overly focused on thinking that if we just find the right term, we'll bring people along with us. And the result is kind of, I think, overcomplicated, alienating, and we're sort of drowning in 3 and 4 letter acronyms, which is not helping anybody, because actually I don't think questions of doing the right thing are as contentious or as complicated as we'd like to think. Another way we might kind of tell this story is, it's fascinating, right, on the face of it. And this is not, if you talk to people that were involved in the origin story of business ethics, this was not inevitable. But we see this division between, there is a team called ethics and compliance that deals with legal compliance, policies and procedures, rules and regulations, legal risk. And then we've had this other function that was originally called CSR, then was called sustainability, then was called ESG. Now we're back to calling it sustainability. That deals with, and the historic frame has been, that is about going beyond compliance. That is about the voluntary commitments that we make to show that we are socially responsible, to show that we care about environmental responsibility. So with that, these two functions have grown up. They don't really speak to each other. They don't have the same reporting lines. They don't have the same remit. They certainly don't have the same jargon. But that frame of sustainability as beyond compliance starts to make less and less sense. Let's look at all the regulation coming out of the EU. Sustainability disclosure, human rights, supply chain oversight are now becoming regulatory issues. So that puts all companies in this very, very difficult position of, well, where do we put ESG? It's no longer beyond compliance. It's now becoming regulated. So what does that mean for how we structure our internal efforts? I think the final thing to say on that point is that this kind of decision by corporations to treat these topics as siloed and delegate them is hitting a wall. The general public is, quite rightly, very, very concerned about greenwashing and overall hypocrisy and mixed messaging. And that in itself is very, very interesting, because we tend to talk about corporations as if they can be a hypocrite or as if they have a single kind of brain, like they're a human. But let's be clear, you will look like a hypocrite if you have not aligned your internal functions. And that's about having a clear through line between ethics and compliance and sustainability. This also needs to involve HR, corporate affairs, government relations, communications, and so on. Because if you don't have that clear through line, if you don't have a holistic view of what your commitments are and aren't, you end up, in this position of a company like Bud Light, where you've said one thing, you've suffered this kind of backlash, and then people conclude that what you're doing is just a cynical marketing effort. So I'm certainly not saying this is easy, but our historic tendency to delegate aspects of this to particular functions and not worry about whether those functions are even talking to each other or understand what each other are doing has certainly hit a brick wall.
I couldn't agree more. And I was having a very interesting conversation this morning with one of our large corporate supporters, and they were talking about if you ask an accountant, what is 2 + 2 = 4? If you ask an engineer, they will say 2 + 2 = 4, but it could also equal 5 and it could also equal 3. And we got into a similar conversation about a live issue that they've been going through recently with having protesters outside their sites.
Mm-hmm.
And that HR would treat that about, from the perspective of how do you engage employees in this, and communications might take it, let's communicate the facts, safety and security of the workforce, which is very important. But if you were going to have a communication that is ethical around that, you'd have a very different conversation about why are the protesters there, how do we feel about it, what do we think about their values, our values. It's a very different conversation that's coming from a very different place and trying to solve a very different challenge. An engaged culture is not necessarily an ethical culture. There are differences there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I also, I don't know what the topic is of these protests, but I'm talking to a lot of companies in both Europe and the US really, really struggling with pressure over their relationships with Israel. And so I think there are, there are lots of questions to ask about how we got here. A lot of this is the aftermath of the commitments companies made on Ukraine, which I think seem more of a black and white issue. I think there's also a wider, often misunderstanding and misconception of what these protests can actually achieve and what the business community can achieve really overall on what is at the end of the day a geopolitical conflict. So I'll take a non-business, well, I suppose it's a business example. At the University of Washington, lots of students are protesting because Boeing is a big funder of the University of Washington and has a lot of buildings. So there are protests there saying that, Boeing needs to stop selling weapons to Israel. Well, the inconvenient truth here is that Boeing's position is tied to the US sovereign. Boeing doesn't get to freelance on where it may or may not choose to sell weapons. And so the problem here is really, if you think this is a problem, it's US government policy you need to be thinking about. Boeing actually doesn't have a lot of choice. And so targeting Boeing arguably is not going to resolve any of these issues. I'm having a lot of conversations with student journalists on this topic. And I think there's there are lots of questions to be asked. Young people feel if they target the banks, they target the endowments, they target the funding of these efforts, then change will happen. And unfortunately, I don't think it's that easy. This conflict has been raging for a very, very long time.
Yeah. Another question I'm going to move to now, coming in from the Q&A from Anita P. I don't have a full name, but 1 in 10 children are in some form of labour. How can we really talk about business ethics when this is acceptable in global supply chains? And I know in your book, Alison, you talk about, needing to look at human rights, as an important component of getting to better conversations, better answers in this space. What are your thoughts on that question?
It's a great conversation. It's a great question. And we're seeing now, obviously there has, with the CSDDD, there is now regulation saying that companies are responsible for what goes on in their supply chains, including detecting and resolving environmental violations, including driving a shift to renewable energy. And then certainly including addressing human rights violations like child labor. So that might seem to be a good news story, but unfortunately, I think it's all a little bit more inconvenient than that. What I worry about is that the way that this is going to play out is that it will involve big multinationals, British multinationals, European multinationals, going to farms and factories in their supply chain and saying, we're going to audit you. You cannot have children on this site. If we find that you have children here, we are going to cut you off and we are going to sue you and we are going to make you pay our legal costs. So, there are inconvenient questions that the topic of child labor raises. I interview somebody in my book who spent a lot of time working in the cocoa industry in West Africa. And what she says is, if you go and talk to the local smallholder farmers, they will very, very often say, I want my children working on this farm. I want my children to inherit this farm. And so there are, I think, inconvenient questions about local conditions, you can say the same thing in supply chain factories. And so then the company has a choice. You can go and you can say, I do not want child labor in my operations. The response of farmers and factory workers then may be, what would you like me to do with my children? And then before you know it, you're funding schools and childcare operations, and trying to, get involved in local economic conditions. You might create dependencies, you might distort the economy. These are very, very, very intractable issues. So child labor is extremely complex, and I think it raises questions rather about what the responsibility of business is beyond auditing and banning these practices in their overall supply chain. It raises questions about what we are expecting a Western corporation to do in these frontier markets where maybe there's not a lot of fiscal capacity, there's not a lot of governance, there's not a lot of primary or secondary education. We are, I think, collectively confused about how far we are then expecting companies to go to take this on. And so I worry a bit about the unintended consequences of these regulations being, one, a move by companies to pull out of these high-risk markets to protect themselves and get a better ESG score, or even more, that we will end up dumping liability and cost on less powerful organizations in the supply chain. So we put in place, a lot of rules and procedures. We're not really, though, doing anything maybe about the pricing and the incentives, and whether we are maybe funding these local entrepreneurs in a way that enables them to develop sustainable businesses, where then maybe they could choose to send their own children to school. So there's a lot of rules, policies, procedures, traceability, transparency to make the Western consumer feel better, and very, very difficult questions about what we're really expecting companies to do about these widest intractable systemic challenges. We can say the same thing about deforestation, biodiversity, climate change, and a number of other topics, as well as child labor. But I think it's a good example of what legal compliance can achieve, but also maybe the limits of what it can achieve. Company lawyers are clever, and they are focused on defending the company from legal risk for good reason. And so we need, again, I think, to think about the wider impact of these measures.
I could have a whole webinar just on that, but I'm going to keep going with the questions that we've got coming in. And that question was from Anita Punwani, who's clarified her name. So thank you for that, Anita. Joanne Kerr has the question, can something like corporate purpose unite the different aspects around ethics, ESG, compliance, etc., if it's truly operationalized throughout the organization and owned by the C-suite?
I make a defense of purpose in the last chapter of the book, or I really say that purpose should be grounded in impact. But that said, I don't think it's a coincidence that purpose is a term most beloved of branding agencies. I think there's been a bit of a tendency to treat this as an empty marketing effort. There are various definitions that say, having a purpose means you only do good for the world, you only are net positive, you don't do anything negative. So there's a bit of a reframe in terms of that's maybe not realistic. Every business that I've ever encountered or worked with has negative externalities, has an impact on society that is both positive and negative. And I don't know that we get anywhere by kind of denying that. I have a very, very intriguing debate when I teach my required ethics class at Stern. We read a sort of hit job article on Amazon, and then I ask the students, my MBA students, well, would you work at Amazon? That divides a classroom 50-50. Half the students will say, yes, it's the most innovative, amazing company in the world. It would advance my career. It's really transformed the environment. Wow, what an incredible opportunity. This is a wonderful business. The other half of the class will be, this company's emissions, its treatment of labor, the way that it has got us all addicted to instant deliveries is an enormous negative externality, and this business needs to go away. So whether you think Amazon is a good or bad business, whether you think Amazon has purpose or not, is obviously not a settled matter. So this gets to the wider question of, right, whose ethics, ethical to whom, purpose in what way? So I do think you can have a purpose, but I think it is about more than reframing your efforts in a positive light. I think it is also about making a good faith effort to clean up your own mess and treat your people with dignity and respect.
Thank you. I've got a question from Louise Terry, who's a trustee of the Institute and a corporate comms professional, and she's the ex-deputy chair of Save the Children, and she says she totally agrees with your assessment of child labour type issues. And her question is, to what extent do you think companies are held back by fear of not being able to explain their actions? If you do the right thing, but it is misinterpreted, you're in a difficult place.
Oh, I love this question. So one of the, probably the biggest surprise of Higher Ground has been how much the book resonated with people in corporate affairs. I've never worked in corporate affairs. I've worked with ethics and compliance, and I've worked with sustainability. I mean, I've come later in my career to think I missed an opportunity here, and this would have been a really, really good fit for me. But I think this point, which is that communications has become increasingly difficult. I think we need to reframe and rethink the whole notion of kind of PR and corporate affairs. You're not just messengers. You're not just order takers. You need to make sure that whatever you're saying the company has done is actually what it is really doing. You need to align internal and external messaging. You need to get clear that if you communicate something internally, it will probably be on social media a day later. And then somehow you need to find a way to communicate nuance and communicate complexity in this world where the general public has got a real gotcha mindset and is really simplistic. And it's all sort of, what about this? What about that? So how you find a way through of, we see this sort of empty setting of net zero goals where companies don't really know how they're going to get there, in the absence of regulation, in the absence of innovation. That's just one example, I think, of the communications challenges. So we need to find a way to flag good faith efforts, communicate complexity, stop this kind of blanket over promising and look at all the wonderful things we're doing. But this is all happening in an environment of misinformation, misunderstanding, a real gotcha mindset. And so I wouldn't claim to have the answers actually on this topic, but I'm having a lot of really, really, really interesting discussions with people in corporate affairs about how to navigate this challenge. And I think there is a whole there's a whole conversation to be had about what communication is even for, when we need to think about this internal alignment and then find a coherent way through this noise that is neither, we're going back to Milton Friedman and shareholder value, but nor is it the sort of tick box over promising that we've seen.
Yes. And this is, again, another topic that I could dive into another hour with you. Fascinating and so resonates with my own experience in corporate affairs. That shift of, there was a moment, and you talk about it in your book, but there was a moment working in communications when social media came in, and you just weren't being held accountable to the same extent, or with journalists who knew your sector, knew your company, and would interrogate your answers which were provided, not in 10 seconds flat and then forgotten, but were printed and held in the public record in a way that today, in the face of misinformation and disinformation, is just not the same landscape whatsoever. And I don't think really quite the corporate affairs function has thought about what its purpose is in the context of that.
And so, there's also this sort of story here, right? Companies are forced now into a much more interactive relationship with a wider group of stakeholders. That is in itself, we could even say that the story of the rise of ESG and sustainability is really a story of social media. But I think one of the mistakes the sustainable community has made is to say, if you do the right thing, if you do a good job on your sustainability commitments, you'll definitely have a better reputation. accountability is not playing out in a linear or fair way. There's an organization out of London called Sigwatch that tracks activist campaigns, and they prove this. You know, NGO activists, yes, they attack the Chevrons and Exxons. They also attack the Starbucks and Unilevers. If you go after, you know, a leading company, a tall poppy in sustainability, you can get them to move. You'll get the whole sector to move. It's a perfectly good strategy, but it's not a good strategy if we say that reputational risk is in some way a fair way to judge corporate efforts. So it's the leaders that get targeted just as much as the laggards. And if we run everything according to reputational risk, we end up with where American companies are right now, which is folding on their DEI efforts because of this Robbie Starbuck guy who has launched a lot of social media campaigns. So if we stand and fall by our social media reputation, we're going to look directionless very, very, very quickly. And I think we've placed too much faith on social license to operate and the ability of the general public to hold companies accountable as part of this discussion. I'm supposed to know something about these topics. I frequently find myself in the supermarket overwhelmed by what sort of coffee I'm supposed to buy with all the labeling and all the claims. And so I don't know that the average stressed person is going to do a better job than me. And so, you know, I think we fantasize that the consumer and stakeholders can judge who's doing a good and bad job and somehow hold companies accountable through their purchasing power and their reputational hits. And the story there, unfortunately, is a lot more complex and a lot more inconvenient.
Fascinating. And on the DEI question, I saw your post on LinkedIn, and I love your LinkedIn posts, you know, but it was on Jamie Dimon, the CEO at JP Morgan Chase, who had sort of really stood up to pressure around DEI and had this fantastic quote, which I loved, which was, "It's good for business, it's morally right, we're quite good at it, we're successful." And I feel like DEI is so critical and so under pressure, more in the US than the UK. Do you feel hopeful that, you know, the workforce, or from a political perspective, that we will turn the corner on that pressure? Or do you think that we will still continue to see corporates step back slightly from some of their DEI commitments in the face of external pressure?
Right. So there's a couple of, for me, there are a couple of threads to this story. I am deeply depressed by seeing companies kind of dialing back on these efforts, because essentially what I think is going on is that general counsels are warning about legal retaliation if we have a Trump presidency. So that is a very good example of how a narrow focus on kind of regulatory risk and political risk does not serve companies well. All these companies seem to have forgotten how angry the general public and employees were in 2018 and 2019. And in the scenario that we do have a Trump presidency in November, we're going to have a lot of very, very, very angry stakeholders expecting more action on this rather than less. So thinking that you are limiting your risk by dialing back on your commitments, I think is a huge mistake. This is a risky landscape either way. That all said, I also think that DEI is not working very well and has been treated as a tick box effort, has been treated as a matter of getting more women and more people of color in the C-suite. It's not about kind of wider inclusion. You know, the whole point of diversity is to get a broader range of perspectives and worldviews on the table and to make better decisions. You don't necessarily achieve that with a sort of Noah's Ark approach of, if we just have a certain number of people of a certain social identity, all our problems will be solved. This is much more about psychological safety. This is much more about involving people in the whole kind of conversation. We need to get better at these efforts. We need to measure them. We need to do proper research and not just make kind of set goals in a vacuum. And so, yeah, finally was really, really relieved and happy to see someone as powerful and influential as Jamie Dimon not responding to this kind of wider chill in the American business community and coming out with a full-throated defense of these efforts. And I believe his organization, I believe JP Morgan, is quite good at this, though still a long way to go when we look at the stories this morning about overworked bankers and someone at JP Morgan being hired to oversee the program. So we're also expecting young people to sit at their desk for 100 hours a week and get on and do deals. That's not a huge driver of inclusion and speaking up.
Yes, I saw that story this morning as well and thought, okay. Okay, so a question that's come in from Jim Bignell. How are we going to achieve real cultural change when CEOs generally are appointed to maximize profit and rewarded to maximize profit? Are we bashing our head against a brick wall? Should we not be encouraging responsible activism where employees make the moral case for prioritizing people and planet issues as well as making an ethical profit? And I think you talked about a bank that was doing, Rabbit Bank, that was doing something on that. Anyway, I will pause there and pass the question to you.
I agree with this to an extent, but I find people and planet too broad. I think one of the problems has been this kind of PR focused over-promising, which is not convincing. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we're still rewarding and valorizing CEOs for a focus on short-term shareholder value. Many companies have moved into financial engineering rather than making their core product well, and so on. At the same time, and this would be yet another frame on the rise of ESG, something I talk about quite a lot is the shift from tangible to intangible value. So back in the 20th century, the vast majority of corporate value was tangible assets, land, cash, bonds, machinery, equipment, things you can see and touch and feel. You build a factory, you manufacture a product, and so on. Now, a far greater proportion of corporate value is intangible value. So that's networks, R&D, IP, brand value, essentially really stakeholder trust. So an example would be Mattel. It's a company that makes plastic toys. Genuinely hard to value that company in the aftermath of Barbie and the success that the company has had as a result of Barbie. So we've got that, I think, this highly imperfect effort to think about the drivers of shareholder value in a different way, but they certainly include perceptions, software, networks, wider kind of ideas of what the company is doing. And so if you just have this very narrow focus on short-term shareholder value that ignores those wider shifts to the need to build trust, the need to communicate with stakeholders, the need to have facility on topics like inclusion, then I think you're not understanding the underlying drivers of what's going on. And I hear that when journalists call me and they say, is ESG a fad? Is ESG over? And I say, well, no. Physical reality still exists. Climate change is still real. Young people still have different values. We've still got social media. We've still got this wider conversation about the need to find companies accountable. So if we treat this as the end of a kind of investor-driven device to make more money, then, yes, ESG is in crisis. If we think about ESG as a highly imperfect response to something going on more broadly in society, then it's very clear that we need to evolve this, not do away with it.
Thank you. And also it'd be remiss of me at this point, 3 weeks into role at the Institute, and so many people, yourself included, have proactively mentioned Annabelle Gillard's recent report for us on the value of culture. So that is in itself, something that needs more attention. So another question now that's come in from someone, how do you deal with compliance window dressing by companies?
Oh gosh, well, that's one of the presenting problems is, if we have more and more and more and more rules, more and more regulations, we impose more and more of these rules on employees, then if the regulator comes after us, we can say we did our best. The implicit frame of compliance is that you provide a sort of regulatory defense mechanism. So if you get in trouble, you can say you've got, adequate procedures. And so we're not thinking about human cognition. We're not start thinking about the reality, which is that we can only process so many rules. We need to understand why we're being asked to follow those rules. We need to know where to go when we've got concerns or we navigate gray areas. So this, to me, is the kind of nub of the challenge facing ethics and compliance officers. You can't just have more and more and more and more. We need to recenter around human behavior, social psychology. The reality is that it's not the case that one employee just wakes up one morning and says, today is a good day to pay a bribe. You're usually gradually inculcated into this behavior by a mix of incentives and leadership and behavior, and what your boss is pushing you to do. And so the compliance team over on the other side having a load of rules saying don't pay bribes may be less important than direct pressure from your boss and to meet your targets. So we need to think about compliance as having a broader remit and, for example, having a role in how we design incentives and not just setting rules.
Fantastic. Going on to another question, we had a question from Sula from Blueprint for Better Business, but I think we've answered that. It was about seeing companies scaling back on their ambitions as a result. Oh, it's now dropped away because I said it was answered. So I'm going to stop reading that out. I'm going to move to a question from Fiona at SSE. Alison, given you are talking at the IBE where supporters, people on the call come from organizations who are committed to ethical behaviors and practices, how do you think we should be trying to amplify our voices above those companies that are not in the ethical space? How do you think the IBE can help us with this?
I think one of the things we need to do is kind of surface some of these tensions. Maybe we needed to reclaim and redefine the notion of ethics so that people don't have this idea that it's about rules and it's about compliance. I suppose I would say that I regard your appointment as part of that journey by which we can kind of bring that stuff to the table. And then I think we all need to stop saying that this isn't about ethics, this is just about good capitalism, that this is always a win-win, that if you do the right thing, you'll just have a better reputation. We need to acknowledge that the most difficult and intriguing questions come for a company when it appears that doing the right thing might cost more and take longer with no obvious benefit to the company. We don't get anywhere by denying that those tensions exist. We need to surface those tensions and surface those conversations and have a better discussion about what we're going to do, about the issues that present risks, the issues that present opportunities, and the issues where it may seem that the company is having a negative impact that may not yet present a risk, but might do in future. And so by treating all of this as a big bucket of kind of ESG stuff that we manage by sort of setting nice public-facing goals and hoping everyone leaves us alone, I don't think is addressing those kind of wider tensions. And so you mentioned Unilever, earlier in the call, we're seeing that company who has had a lot of investor activist pressure, has really had a lot of criticism for scaling back on the ambition. I think it's appropriate that Unilever has focused much more narrowly on 4 issues it can properly affect. I think it's appropriate that the company has admitted to its failures on plastic. And what I'm hearing is a lot of other corporations are kind of saying behind the scenes, we're really glad you went first, because we all need to go in this more kind of limited and honest and restrained direction. And you're getting all the flack so that we can now kind of follow along in your path. But I'm seeing a new era of restraint. I think that is good. It just needs to be accompanied by another positive thing that Unilever has done with policy alignment and more honesty about what we are expecting of government, what we are expecting of business, what we're expecting of civil society. We need to get beyond that era of only business has the scale and reach to solve these problems. Only business can tackle these problems because we're desperate and we no longer trust government. We need to be clear that many companies have made aggressive sustainability commitments that are being undermined by their government relations teams every day.
Yeah, so interesting, so interesting. And I feel like that is, both realism in organizations, what's really going on, what can we actually do, and being crystal clear about, and what can we not do, and where do we need to collaborate, where do we need to work with others, and be really overt and clear about that. And if you do not have line of sight to what you can do, don't pretend that you can, because then you're probably conflicting one of your values around honesty and integrity. You need to be walking up to these challenges in a very open way, both within your culture, in order that you have challenge in a culture so that you can innovate and problem solve, but also externally so that you can innovate and problem solve the challenges that we're all going to have to come together to address, in order that we can move forward with business and sustainability working absolutely as one.
Absolutely. And the way I put it in the book is, before you go out there promising to change the world and make the world better, first do your best to make your business better.
Absolutely.
Focus on the stakeholders you can impact. Focus on your employees. Don't go out there making a lot of commitments about DEI if you're not paying a living wage and not treating your workers properly. Don't go out there claiming you've got these big net zero goals if you're lobbying against climate, regulation. So just, maybe take on fewer problems, but do it properly. And I think, to your question, or to your point, it's become extremely hard for companies to say, I understand this is important to a particular stakeholder group, but it's just not a priority. Strategy is the art of choosing what not to do. But if you are courageous to go out there and say, here are our priorities, which means these are not our priorities, you're going to get a lot of criticism. And that's just the reality. But we need to somehow back out of this era of overpromising.
Fantastic, thank you. And we've got a question from Brian Rogers, and that's come in, which is, what ethics lessons can we learn from the Post Office, P&O Ferries, Grenfell, and other corporate scandals? And I suppose, to me, as I read that question, what I take out of that is, when a company is going through a corporate scandal, what should it be doing in order to ensure that it's learning? I mean, I don't know if you have anything in particular you'd want to say on Post Office, P&O Ferries, or Grenfell. Huge issues in the UK, the Post Office in particular.
I mean, tragic cases, all of them. And, there's a depressing story. It's very often people say, same story with Wells Fargo, people didn't speak up, they didn't say anything. In all these cases, people did say things. They did flag challenges. There were complaints. There was a lot of distress, and the senior leadership just didn't want to hear it. So again, the frame is, we treat this stuff as a reputational regulatory defense mechanism, not in good faith a process to surface and address concerns. So we need to, we need to listen. We need to provide channels to listen, and then we need to act. And part of the issue is, we see this as defensive. We see this as a way to protect shareholder value. We don't see this in good faith as a way to surface and address concerns, which very often the wider workforce is in a much better position to flag concerns than senior leadership team. Because if you're powerful, I'm sorry, but people lie to you. People tell you what you want to hear, and you tend to underestimate how intimidating it may be for people to tell you the truth.
Yeah, so interesting. And we're coming out in 3 weeks' time with our Ethics at Work survey, which is looking at some of those issues. Such an enormous topic to keep it safe so that you can learn. At the Institute at the moment, we're working on a law task force project separately to some of the issues that you've just talked about, to look at ethics in the law profession. But what I've noticed online has been a lot of conversation about lawyers involved in the Post Office issue, saying that they, that did they need to have better access to opportunities to speak up? That, this idea of Margaret Heffernan brilliant book, Willful Blindness, which comes into this, which, talks about, you sort of know that this is an issue, but you're not potentially talking about it. And so we're looking at what can the law profession do on that. But I think some of those sort of sector specific challenges that have come up as a result of through the inquiry into the Post Office would be really interesting to look at, and to consider how do we have a really structured approach to the lessons that we need to learn for lots of different professions and areas of industry.
Yeah, there's a really scathing article in the Law Society Gazette from Robert Barrington, who used to run TI UK, about these topics, more from the point of kind of oligarchs and offshore finance and lawyers saying, well, we've got to represent everybody. And I think there has been a broad resistance to more ethical oversight in the legal profession, and a notion we just kind of serve our clients no matter what, and some really kind of bad faith arguments. Yeah, I think and back to TI, there's this kind of gatekeepers initiative. It's not just lawyers, it's accountants, it's consultants. There's a lot of culpability in the service professions. I'm highly interested in this conversation. If anyone would like to involve me in those efforts.
Brilliant. Okay, so some feedback, good to hear about the nuance between profits and ethics. Paul Merton from Raytheon, what do we know about the psychology of doing the wrong thing? What is a mystery to me is how several senior intelligent and successful people at the post office could not see that the decisions they were making were so wrong. So touches on where we were just going, actually. Yeah, interesting.
So it's an intriguing fact that we all think we're more ethical than average, just like we all think we're better than average drivers. But have you seen all the idiots out there on the road? I often give talks and I start with a survey for people that are not properly primed. And I say, how ethical do you think you are on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being high? Doesn't matter the size of the audience. If it's 30 or 50 or 100 or 5,000, you will typically get 80 to 85% of respondents rating themselves a 4 or a 5. So we are very judgmental about others. There's a quote in the Bible here about this. We are very, very inclined to forgive ourselves. We are subject to motivated reasoning. If we want to believe something, we look for reasons it can be true. If we don't want to believe for something, we look for reasons we can ignore it. And then I think there's a narrowing. I think very often, we evade accountability. I wasn't really making that decision about the post office. I was just overseeing this particular function or making this particular decision. And so you get into this sort of kind of like the Albert Eichmann problem. I was just following orders. I didn't have any power to change this. I was just kind of a big part of the machine. So there's something about more awareness of the reality of social psychology, of human psychology. And then there's something about how we build and address internal kind of accountability structures to make speaking up more effective and make it be listened to. But we need to start with the reality that human beings behave in a certain way. We're biased, we're self-serving, we are highly social creatures, we are influenced by our surroundings much more than we're influenced by writing on the wall or policies and procedures. If we bear all that in mind, we can treat ethics as a design culture problem rather than a question of rules.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to draw our discussion to a close there, Alison. It has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much, and congratulations again on the book. It's, as I said, it really did influence me, in even taking this role. It kind of helped me realize that, yes, this is absolutely what I want to be doing right now. And so thank you, and huge congratulations, and thank you for your time today. That's been such a great conversation.
Lauren, I'm so excited to see what you're going to achieve in this role, and look forward to working with you more closely and continuing the discussion. It was such a privilege to be here. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and I wish you all a wonderful evening.